The old woman's heart had stopped once already, and the only thing keeping her son from collapsing was the desperate belief that somehow, somewhere, one person would choose to help them. He stood barefoot outside the emergency room, his shirt damp with sweat, his pockets holding nothing but a few crumpled coins. Behind the glass doors, doctors rushed around his mother while the hospital monitor screamed its warning. He had spent the last of his money on the ambulance, sold his phone, and even given away the small toolbox that had been his only source of income. Now he had nothing left except a trembling voice and a promise he had made to his dying mother years ago. His name was Arlen Mercer, a 32-year-old mechanic who had learned early in life that poverty did not simply take away comfort, sometimes it took away choices. He lived with his 68-year-old mother, Maribel, in a tiny rented house at the edge of the city. The roof leaked during heavy rain, the refrigerator worked only when it wanted to, and Arlen often skipped meals so his mother could have enough food. Yet Maribel never complained. She had raised him alone after his father disappeared when Arlen was 6, working long hours cleaning offices and washing clothes for wealthy families. Her hands had become rough and permanently marked by years of labor, but she still smiled whenever Arlen came home. That morning had begun like every other ordinary day. Sunlight filled the narrow kitchen, birds moved across the power lines outside, and Maribel was preparing tea when she suddenly dropped the cup. Arlen heard the crash and ran into the room. His mother was standing beside the table, one hand pressed against her chest, her face pale. He caught her before she fell. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, but the paramedic's expression told him that the situation was serious. At the hospital, doctors discovered that Maribel needed an emergency procedure immediately. Without it, they said, she might not survive the day. Arlen had stared at the estimated cost and felt the world disappear beneath his feet. The amount was more money than he had seen in his entire life. He begged the billing officer to give him time. He promised to work extra shifts, repair cars for free, clean the hospital, do anything. But hospital rules were hospital rules. There were forms, deposits, approvals, and procedures. Arlen understood none of it. All he understood was that his mother was behind a door and time was running out. He finally found Drive, Soren Vale near the emergency ward. The doctor was 47, respected, calm, and known for handling complicated cardiac cases. Arlen stepped in front of him with tears running down his face. He begged him not to let money decide whether his mother lived. He told the doctor that he had no savings, no insurance, and no family member wealthy enough to help. He offered his labor, his home, everything he owned. Soren listened silently, but the hospital administrator standing nearby reminded him that the procedure required authorization. Arlen fell to his knees. The hallway went quiet. He begged the doctor to save his mother first and worry about the payment later. Soren looked at the exhausted man, then toward the emergency room. For a moment, his professional expression broke. He knew what it felt like to lose someone because of circumstances beyond his control. Years earlier, his younger brother had died because their family could not afford treatment. That memory still lived inside him. Soren turned toward the administrator and insisted that the medical team begin preparing Maribel immediately. He said they would find a solution for the financial side afterward. It was not enough to solve everything, but it bought Arlen something priceless, time. If stories about kindness, second chances, and people helping one another touch your heart, please like, comment, share this story, and subscribe to the channel Wisdom Story House. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories of hope and humanity to you. Inside the operating area, nurses moved quickly. Arlen sat alone beneath the bright daytime windows of the waiting room, staring at his hands. Those hands had repaired hundreds of engines, replaced broken transmissions, and brought dead machines back to life. But they could do nothing for the woman who had given him those hands. Hours passed. Then a strange sound came from outside. A line of dark luxury vehicles had stopped near the hospital entrance. Staff members looked through the glass as a tall man in a perfectly fitted navy suit stepped out of the middle car. He was 61, with silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His name was Cassian Rourke, one of the city's most powerful billionaires and the owner of several technology and manufacturing companies. Arlen barely noticed him, until Cassian walked directly into the hospital. The billionaire had not come for publicity, business, or a press event. He had come because his driver had told him that a mechanic named Arlen Mercer was somewhere inside the hospital. Cassian stopped when he saw him. Arlen looked up, confused. Cassian stared at the young man for several seconds before asking his name. When Arlen answered, the billionaire's face changed. He reached into his coat and removed an old photograph. It showed a young woman standing beside a little boy. Arlen recognized the woman immediately. His mother. His breathing stopped. Cassian explained that 27 years earlier, when he was still a struggling businessman, he had nearly lost everything after a major company deal collapsed. He had been living in a cheap hotel, carrying debts he could barely understand, and considering giving up on his business completely. One rainy evening, a young woman working at the hotel had noticed him sitting alone in the lobby. She had brought him food even though she could barely afford her own dinner. That woman had been Maribel. She had never told Arlen about it because, to her, helping someone was not an achievement worth remembering. But Cassian had remembered. Her kindness had changed the course of his life. She had encouraged him to try again, told him that failure did not make a person worthless, and even lent him money from her tiny paycheck so he could travel to another city for a business opportunity. Cassian had eventually rebuilt his company, becoming enormously wealthy. Over the years, he had tried to find her, but she had moved several times and disappeared from his life. Until that day, Cassian had discovered her name through an old employment record only that morning. And now she was fighting for her life. Arlen could hardly speak. He suddenly understood that the stranger standing in front of him was not simply a billionaire who had arrived to pay a hospital bill. He was a man carrying a debt of gratitude that had survived nearly 3 decades. Cassian immediately authorized payment for every medical expense connected to Maribel's treatment. But then he did something that shocked everyone. He told the hospital that money was not enough. He asked the doctors to use whatever resources were necessary to give Maribel the best chance possible. Dr. Soren returned from the operating area later that afternoon. He told Arlen that the procedure had gone well, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Arlen finally broke down. Cassian placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time in years, Arlen allowed himself to cry without trying to hide it. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital windows when Maribel finally opened her eyes. Arlen was sleeping in a chair beside her bed, his head resting against the mattress. When she moved her hand, he woke instantly. She smiled weakly. Arlen kissed her hand and cried again. Then Cassian entered the room. Maribel looked at him for several seconds before recognition slowly appeared in her eyes. She remembered the young businessman from decades ago. She remembered the lonely man who had once believed his life was over. She smiled. Cassian lowered his head, overcome with emotion. He told her that he had spent years trying to repay what she had done for him, but she had already forgotten the entire event. Maribel simply told him that kindness was never supposed to be a business transaction. You helped someone because they needed help, she explained, not because you expected something in return. Those words stayed with everyone in the room. Arlen later learned that Cassian had another surprise. He had discovered that Arlen's small mechanic business had been struggling because the workshop he rented was being sold. Instead of simply giving him money, Cassian offered him a position managing a new automotive restoration center the billionaire was building. Arlen would be paid well and would have the freedom to continue working with his hands. Arlen refused at first, saying he did not want charity. Cassian smiled and told him it was not charity. It was an opportunity. Months later, Arlen stood inside a bright new workshop surrounded by tools, vehicles, and young apprentices learning mechanical skills. He had created a small program for unemployed people who wanted to learn automotive repair. He remembered what it felt like to have no options, so he wanted others to have a second chance before desperation became their only companion. Maribel recovered slowly. She could not work anymore, but she spent her mornings sitting near the workshop window, watching her son build the life he had once thought was impossible. Dr. Soren continued visiting her for checkups. He became more than her doctor, he became a trusted friend. And Cassian never stopped visiting. One afternoon, nearly a year after the hospital emergency, the 3 men sat together while Maribel watched from a nearby chair. Arlen realized something that changed how he viewed his entire life. The miracle had not been the billionaire's money. It had not been the hospital procedure or the expensive equipment. The miracle had started decades earlier with one poor woman sharing food with a stranger who had nothing. Her kindness had traveled through time. It had reached her son when he needed help most. And it had reminded a billionaire that the greatest fortunes are not measured by money, but by the lives we touch when nobody is watching. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House. Sometimes one small act of kindness can travel farther than we will ever know. And before you leave, I have one special request. Comment, kindness always returns. If you believe that a good deed can change a life, even years after we think everyone has forgotten it. Arlen never forgot that day outside the emergency room. He never forgot how helpless he had felt, begging a doctor to save the woman who meant everything to him. But he also never forgot the moment a billionaire stepped out of a car and reminded him that sometimes help arrives from the most unexpected place. Years later, whenever someone asked Arlen how he became successful, he never mentioned the billionaire, the workshop, or the money. He simply looked toward his mother and said that everything began with a woman who once gave away her last meal to a stranger. And Maribel would smile quietly, because she knew the truth. She had never been rich. But she had spent her entire life giving away the one thing that made everyone around her richer, kindness.